I'll make a start. Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone who's joined this webinar, this OASPA Jisc Publishing Workflows webinar. I see people are still joining, but I'm going to make a start and talk slowly while people are joining. So, yes, this meeting is being recorded. If you haven't noticed the record announcement as you joined, please, as it's a webinar rather than the sort of Zoom meeting functionality, we've got the Q&A function and a chat function. Please use the chat function, just chatting and asking any technical queries. But if you have any questions for anybody, please put it in the Q&A function, and you can also upvote some of those questions. As I mentioned, this is a publication workflow webinar. It's the first in a series of PID workflow webinars. We've got the publication. This is the first, obviously, data, funding, and institutional research management. And obviously today we're focusing on publications and publishing workflows. I'm just going to do this introduction and welcome while people are joining, and I'm going to hand over to Josh. And I'm not going to run through the whole agenda because we only have an hour, and so time is limited. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Josh.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just pull up my slides, everyone. Brilliant. And thanks to Jisc and OASPA for inviting me to speak at this webinar. It's a pleasure to be able to share this work. Just a funding acknowledgement at the beginning. This work was commissioned by Jisc using funding that came from UKRI, our national funder here in the UK. So thank you to both those organisations for their support through this project. My name's Josh Brown. I'm one of the 4 consultants at More Brains Cooperative, and I'll be talking today about work we've been doing looking at a vision of a PID optimised future, I think is the way we put it. So these are based on real-world current processes and inefficiencies with those processes, and we've explored the ways that different persistent identifiers have the potential to address those inefficiencies, make things easier, or enable things that have not so far been possible. So I think one of the key things here is that identifiers have incredible power across the entire research lifecycle to improve workflows, to improve the quality of metadata, to reduce author or researcher burden, and to improve communication between different stakeholders. And I'm sure that all of the speakers following me on the session today will have their own examples of this. But one of the things I wanted to do here is show this infographic. There is an online version of this which is interactive, and you can see the URL on the screen there. But the key thing here is, I think it demonstrates just the level of just using a small number of PIDs, we can show all the information dependencies across the whole research life cycle, from starting to apply for a grant right through to doing that work, publishing the outcomes, linking those published outcomes to different data sets, software, and so on, and then reporting it back to your institution or your funder at the end of that process. And the key thing here is publishers, for instance, really depend on funders and institutions to use these PIDs effectively. And if those funders and institutions are sharing metadata as early as possible in the life cycle, it makes all those subsequent processes easier and more efficient and more transparent. Now, as Chris mentioned, there are 4 workflows in this series. This is just one of the 4, and between them all, they cover the entire research lifecycle. So the funding workflow begins with developing a grant and goes right through to impact and evaluation. The institutional research management workflow goes from pre-award processes where people are preparing funding applications or developing their project ideas through the process of conducting that. The data workflow looks at the creation, curation, publication, sharing, and preservation of data. And the content publication workflow is the one we'll talk about today. So I'll move on to that in a bit more detail. Now, these workflows are based on a number of workshops and feedback sessions, and they come from a number of perspectives. So they take in contributions from publishers, repositories, preprint servers, systems providers. And as you can see from the various forks in this route, we come through from the idea that there are certain common prerequisites that precede publication. That's just things like authors registering for an ORCID ID, or if a paper comes from a funded grant, registering a DOI for that grant. It includes the dotted green boxes cover processes involving preprint servers. Then we have the OA journal, we have toll access publishing, we have common processes that undertake them both. And then after that, we have some processes where, say, a preprint is then linked to the version of record that's come out via a journal, and also post-publication, the author's accepted manuscript is added to an institutional subject repository. Then all of these things come together into some more processes. I'm just going to pull out a few examples from this workflow. You'll get a sense when you see these examples of just how much ground is covered across these. There are many, many, many boxes and arrows in the real thing. So do please take your time and have a look through those at your leisure. I'm just going to highlight some examples today, and then we'll talk more about how PIDs are being used now. And just before we go into these examples, just to reiterate, this is a vision of a PID optimized future. Not all of these steps are being undertaken at the moment. And some of them have preconditions or dependencies that aren't yet comprehensively met. So this is an idea that we can, the idea of these workflows is we can establish some shared goals, a shared vision of this future, and we can work backwards from that and figure out what all of us across the scholarly communications community and all those stakeholders affected by it can do to enable this whole system to work a little bit more effectively. So our first example here is about collecting authors' affiliations and gathering things like funding acknowledgements or facilities acknowledgements for those who've had access to shared resources. Could be an archive, it could be a giant underground synchrotron. Now, the key thing here is if you are collecting an author's ORCID ID when they submit an article, with data associated with it. Now we give examples here of DOIs. Now those could be linked to grants, the ORCID IDs for other individuals the person has worked with, the RAID ID, the research activity identifier for the projects they have worked on, and the RAW, the research organization identifier for their organizational affiliations. Now that could be education, but it could also cover the affiliations of collaborators. It could also cover places people have previously worked. And the key thing here with all of that data, pulling it in and passing that, it actually means that it's much simpler to detect conflicts of interest and also to select a reviewer from your pool who does not have any of those conflicts of interest, with obvious implications for the integrity of the review process. It also means that, for instance, one of the examples you can see on the screen in front of you, if you can read it, I'm not sure how big the screen you're seeing this on is, but the key thing there is you could also pull in things like funding acknowledgements. So, you know, you pull in that the author signs in and gives you their ORCID ID, and the next thing they see is a screen with all of the grants associated with that ID. And you say, which of these, if any, is associated with the article you're submitting? The researcher selects one from a checkbox, clicks save, and the funding acknowledgement is automatically pulled in. And that's made available in both machine and human readable form. It can be embedded in the final article. It can be embedded in the metadata. It can be linked to the metadata when the publisher registers a DOI for that article, at which point funders and others will know about it. It also just means that all of these kind of acknowledgements are, again, collected at the earliest possible moment, which means that if there are specific policies or other terms and conditions or requirements that apply as a result of that funding, the publisher is told about those, again, right from the offset, and can start to begin to deal with those at the beginning. The second example here is, again, about peer review, COIs. All of this, if you can collect it, the information about people's activities, businesses they've worked with, those kinds of things as well, you can really start to identify. Corporate funders may not appear in the classic scholarly record, but could appear via these PID systems using legal entity identifiers or national or local business IDs. That could be the company's house number in the UK, the Australian business number, wherever else, whatever other system is applicable, wherever in the world you are based. The key thing here is reviewers registering their ORCID IDs and exposing this information when they become a reviewer, when they're invited to become a reviewer for one of your journals. They share this information, and you can have this in your own database. And you can have it so that when they update their ORCID record, that information is automatically updated in your system as well. And that just means you're not constantly going back to people and checking these things. You can actually eliminate a lot of work for reviewers as well as yourselves in this process. So the key thing here is not just about identifying conflicts of interest, it's reducing the burden on reviewers and the burden on authors of making sure that we maintain the integrity of the review process. And this all requires, again, the institutions and funders to be populating people's ORCID IDs with details of the projects or putting the affiliations data in. But I think that it just shows that if this data is readily available, the impact of this on real world processes is significant and would be, I think, felt almost immediately. Finally, and I think this is one that this is a subject that will be close to the heart of many of my other speakers following me today, this idea of automated event notifications. Now, there are things that are happening earlier in the process, which I think are really relevant to this topic. Just things like knowing that an article has been submitted, or knowing that an article associated with a particular grant has been accepted for publication, and we'll hear more about the potential value there. But I think here that you can see examples here that once something is published, using these PIDs, it's much easier to direct information about that event to the institution. So here could go via the OA switchboard or the Jisc publications router or other notification services. Some PID systems have built-in notifications, for instance. There's an interaction between Crossref and DataSite DOIs and ORCID that enables people to get automatic updates to their ORCID record when a new DOI is registered with a link to that person, and from there that could send a notification to a repository, for instance, to ask for the author's accepted manuscript if that was one pathway towards compliance with the funder's open access policy. The key thing here is detecting these PIDs and triggering actions on the basis of them is actually very simple. It's done now in many ways, but if we could build up the coverage and we could get more comprehensive adoption of these PIDs, guarantee the presence of this metadata in those PID registries and in people's PID records, that would supercharge these existing infrastructures. The potential of things like the open access switchboard or the publications router is huge. They're already incredibly useful, but just think if all of this data was reliably present and these events were routinely triggered, the value that could bring, the time savings that could bring, the efficiencies this could deliver across the whole research information scholarly communication network is really significant. Not least in that it gets authoritative metadata and accurate information into systems from the source early as possible. And again, think about where people are having to assemble this information years later for national research evaluation exercises or subsequent grant applications. Imagine if all of this data had been there from day one, how much effort we could save. So the impacts go way beyond the publishing network, but I think the publishers as such a core component in scholarly communication and such a valuable conduit for information have a unique power, both in terms of information and aggregating it and repackaging it in ways that makes it really valuable, but also in helping to trigger a lot of these automatic or automated processes and enabling a lot of these value to be delivered. So we've done some analysis, as I say, across these full workflows, and I think, as I said in my opening remarks, we did kind of aim for this to be a shared goal, a kind of a vision of a shared future. None of these workflows are perfect, so that they're a representation of quite diverse processes. So some things don't happen in some versions of the process. In other versions of the process, things happen in a slightly different order. But our idea is that sort of 80% of the people who look at this should recognize 80% of the content of these workflows. And we draw out some key lessons. There's a report, you'll see the link on the next slide, but I just wanted to highlight these messages for the content platforms, content publication platforms, repositories, preprint servers, publishers, and so on. These are some of the things that could be done now and should be done ubiquitously now to make sure that this value is being delivered. The first is collecting and authenticating ORCID IDs for authors and reviewers and pulling in information from those records. If you are pulling information from those records, that goes a long way towards demonstrating their value towards research, to authors. That encourages authors to make sure that information is populated. It encourages authors to go to their institution and ask them to populate their ORCID records on their behalf. And it creates a bit of a virtuous circle. The other component here is things like grant DOI search and lookup tools. Now, I mentioned a process there where you get your manuscript tracking system detects an ORCID ID and pulls in grant information and surfaces that to generate funding acknowledgements. Now, those lookup tools can be built now, and also the presence of doing those tools encourages funders to start registering DOIs comprehensively for their grants and possibly backdating some of those so they can maybe capture the previous years. So grants that are just publishing now that might have been awarded or projects that finished a few years ago can still be captured in this same way. That would create a huge flow of information through, enrich publication metadata and save a huge amount of time. And the same token, I think there's something here about pulling those PIDs in from different registries, pulling those PIDs in from different systems, and people's ORCID records is a great conduit for this, for projects, grants, organizations, contributors, other entities, and putting those into the outputs themselves and also into the metadata associated with it. Now, most PIDs are actually machine actionable, and they can be used to go to the source, the PID registry, and pull more information in. So really the effort there needs to be in making those human readable as well. So putting them in a context so that that PID appears as a human comprehensible citation, if you like. But putting those PIDs in makes a huge difference. And the more these PIDs are used, the more incentive there is for institutions, funders, other players in the system to start supporting them, registering them, updating them as they go, because they can really start to see the value and the incentive for them. Finally, I think the key thing here, and I know many of the people on this call will already be doing this, but registering DOIs or an equivalent PID for outputs. And this especially, I think, is relevant maybe for the repository or preprint server community, but making sure that these PIDs are linked. There is the most complete metadata possible available, created at the time of registration, and also, and this I think is something that is a message that you've all probably heard before, but it helps to reiterate it. And I think for everyone registering PIDs is commit to updating those metadata records into the future. This isn't just about retractions or corrections. This is about making sure that there are, you're updating this with new links to project or subsequent grants, or making sure your references are as complete as possible and using the PIDs. But especially for those who are linking data post-publication, linking back to the VOR, of course, is critical. And some of those links may be worthy of inclusion in the core metadata for the original article as it was published. Those are our core messages that we have for publishers and other content communication platforms. But really the overall lesson here is all of these pieces coming together to form a coherent pattern. Comprehensive, consistent PID adoption creates efficiencies. I think I've given some examples of those. I hope they spark your imagination. You can think of more for yourselves, and I hope that in exploring the workflows, you will be able to see many more examples there as well that might resonate with you or your colleagues, or help to make the business case within your organization for doing some of this work on PIDs. The other component here is actually that it's not just about efficiencies, it's about rendering things possible that have not been possible so far. So the kind of analysis and insights, understanding much more about the relationships between the authors submitting their articles to your journals that go beyond just co-authorship, for instance, could be really valuable, both in terms of finding reviewers, in terms of marketing your journals, in terms of understanding the reach of your content. There's a huge amount of insight that could be generated from that data. Our goal with these workflows was to kind of, as I said, create a shared ambition, a shared vision for everyone across the sector in this, and hopefully there to kind of unlock some of those dependencies and bring people together in action to help us realize this vision. So you've already seen the links to the kind of the overview infographic, the interactive version. You've also seen the link to the workflows themselves online. There is a citable version linked in this spreadsheet, in this slide deck as well. And the last DOI I'll present here is the one to the report that accompanies this. Now, that report contains all the acknowledgements. So I'd just like to thank everyone on this call who contributed to this process at the various stages, whether that was the original workshops or the subsequent review. If you'd like to see whose brains we picked in this process, there's a long list in that report. And you can also see how this relates to work we're asking funders to do, asking institutions to do, and asking research data platforms and other kinds of research infrastructure to undertake. The whole thing is set out very clearly there. So I'm just going to end just by saying it's been a pleasure to speak to you all today. We will have a little bit of, I believe I'll be around for a Q&A now, but there will be more Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if I don't get to you now, we'll get to you at the end. And there's my email address. If you have questions, you want to stay in touch after this session, please do drop me a line. I will look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Josh. We do have a few questions, but in the interest of time, I think if we can't cover them by typing the answers, we'll get to them later. But I'd like to move on now to Katrina McCallum from Hindawi, who's going to talk about why publishers should care.
Yeah, so, oops, apologies. Can you see my screen yet? No. Let's share my screen. So can you see it okay?
Yes, it's fine.
That's great. So if Josh hasn't convinced you, I've got 5 minutes to tell you why publishers should care. And so I essentially tried, Josh gave you lots of examples as well, and I've essentially tried to sort of summarize that in one slide from a sort of publishing perspective. And so having PIDs connected, and the thing here, which Josh also mentioned, is there's no point having one PID. We need more than one PID. It's the collection of PIDs working together are much greater than the sum of any individual PID. And that helps us to enable search and discovery. It links articles to other research outputs, researchers, organizations. It helps provide persistent provenance and credit for researchers right up and from when they publish their very first communication about their work, be it a preprint or a micropub or an article. It actually makes research on research easier as well. It helps, as Josh mentioned, with researcher evaluation and research evaluation. It fundamentally helps make publications and the whole process of publishing more trustworthy. It can be used to help mitigate and track fraud and fraudulent actors if you're collecting identity and being able to verify this through different routes. It also helps identify, track, and manage conflicts of interest much earlier in the workflow. And this is something that Josh has mentioned. This is one workflow that we've implemented at Hindawi, where we collect raw submissions, and then we use raw to match conflicts of interest between editors, authors, reviewers, and so on. And that's in process. It provides a whole suite of the basis of the development for new tools and services on top of PIDs, discovery services, marketing services, search services. It also enables more efficient tracking and reporting of costs and pricing for publishing services, and in line with different funder and institutional policies. And again, that's going to be the subject of much of the rest of this webinar that Yvonne will introduce with the OA switchboard. It also helps reduce manual labor in workflows. One of the business arguments we used to introduce RAW was that it would make it much more efficient, much less hands-on people doing Google searches and et cetera, and looking for conflicts of interest. Ultimately, this is about reducing the administrative burden for researchers as well. If we tie up all of these things together, researchers are not going to be filling in multiple forms in different ways in different places, likewise for institutions. And Josh and Morebrains did a cost breakdown and analysis just for institutions. That's not yet been done for publishers because the data are not available, but it was a massive cost saving for institutions. It provides very, very powerful marketing tools and a way to collect intelligence on how your content's being used, who's using it, where the new subjects are coming, who's collaborating, the impact of that. I mean, it just essentially makes science communication more cost-effective and efficient. Ultimately, it's better for science and it's better for publishing. And this is because we're dealing with a global network. This is actually a co-authorship network from back in 2017. We just have to put that on stilts. It's not just co-authors, it's everything. Research outputs, funders, organizations, projects, materials, tools. And essentially what we're doing here is we're wiring up a scholarly network for open science, for collaboration. And PIDs form the essential wiring for that scholarly network. Metadata, it's hugely important. You can't just have a PID with no metadata. Metadata are key because that enriches the network and we need high quality metadata. And the openness of those PIDs and that metadata is the fuel that allows the innovation, that allows the efficiencies that we can see in the workflows, and it will allow innovation in both science and science communication. So my main message to publishers is that we need to support, invest in, and transition to open scholarly PIDs and make your metadata open at the same time. The reliance on and continued investment into proprietary PIDs and closed metadata is only going to create barriers to independent research and scrutiny, which is hugely important in terms of trust and science. It slows innovation, hampers communication and collaboration among researchers and wider society, and holds back the progress of science. This is a collective action problem. It's a collective action both when we think about we all have to play our part in order to see the and to realize the benefits of PIDs. It's also we have to use PIDs collectively to realize the benefits of using those PIDs in our workflows. So this is an appeal to you. I'll stop there and pass over to the next person.
Thank you, Katrina. I think we'll move swiftly on to PIDs in practice for publishers from Yvonne, for our panel session.
Thanks, Chris. PIDs in practice, that is a nice bridge. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. PIDs in practice, indeed. I was invited to bring together 3 publishers, and I'm really pleased that Ljubo Penna from Pensoft is here, Johannes Wagner from Copernicus, and Rob O'Donnell and Miguel Peralta from Rockefeller University Press, because they are going to tell you the real thing, how they've done it, what they've learned, how they've gone about it. I will do a brief introduction about the OA Switchboard and how we are a community of publishers, institutions, and funders that work together to share best practices and learn from each other, and draw this conclusion that maybe it's hard work, it's not rocket science. So a couple of slides for introduction. OA Switchboard, mission-driven, community-led initiative designed to simplify the sharing of information between stakeholders about open access publications throughout the whole publication journey. And in the first 2 years of its existence, we've learned one thing, and that is that persistent identifiers are critical to solving real problems, as the previous speakers have also alluded to, and we've seen it hands-on, but also to grasping real opportunities. So I'll skip this in the interest of time, but our community consists of these libraries, institutions, consortia, publishers, and research funders. And it's a mission-driven initiative. So this is really sharing the vision of the transformation to open science and doing that together, and therefore taking this collaborative action. But the Switchboard is also a practical tool, and it currently supports 2 use cases, and that's where we learned all these lessons. One is reporting made easy on version of record. So at the end of the publication process that Josh was referring to. And the other one is during the publication process, matching publication costs with publication funds. And to work on these very practical use cases, you cannot do without PIDs. So the message hub, that is what Switchboard is, the exchange of standardized metadata through a protocol, is supported and is covering all existing PIDs. So we're not reinventing the wheel. DOI, ORCID, RAID was already mentioned, but we're also dealing with ISNI, Ringgold, and ROR is actually the identifier that supports the routing in the Switchboard. And where does this come in? Josh was referring to the whole research cycle. The Switchboard at the moment only deals from submission to post-publication. And this is where the next speakers, but actually already before they joined the Switchboard, gained so much experience as to how critical it is to have your PIDs in order. So I'm going to first introduce to you Johannes Wagner from Copernicus, who will talk about ORCID. Dan Ljubo from Pensoft will talk about research funders and grants, and Rob and Miguel from Rockefeller will talk about ROR. And I want to explicitly say that that doesn't mean that these are the only PIDs that these publishing houses are working on, but we've asked them to focus on one to give a clear story. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you and welcome. Thank you all for having me. Yeah, I was asked to give a very brief introduction to what Copernicus does in terms of ORCIDs. I hope you can all see my screen. This will be very quick. We've been implementing or have been running with ORCIDs since 2012, so pretty much, I guess, since the beginning. ORCIDs are not mandatory. That's a question that we get very often. So is it mandatory in your system? And it's not, but it's highly recommended. So whenever we communicate with authors and they don't have an ORCID yet, we usually would send out a reminder. Think of adding your ORCID. We collect them, excuse me, actually not during submission, but directly in the author's user profiles in our systems, and there it stays. And whenever an author pops up anywhere in any paper on any contribution, actually, that sort of moves through our systems, we automatically add the ORCID ID with the official little green button. And this is what it looks like on an author list here on the right-hand side, for example. We have one big advantage in this, and that's that we're not only a publisher, but we're also a meeting organizer. So for all our meetings, whenever an author, registers for a conference or submits an abstract to a proceedings, journal, something, we also collect ORCIDs, and then they are stored in our databases, and we have sort of multiple inflow points that we can also use in our papers, which has worked out very well for us. We've seen very, I guess, rather good uptake in 2013 already. 30% of our authors, so on all papers we published, about 30% of our authors had ORCIDs defined. It's been steadily rising, not as quickly and as we had hoped, but now we're around 45%, something like this. And overall, our entire content that's registered across Crossref, we have about 70% of the content has ORCIDs included. We haven't really seen a particular, increased or decreased uptake among different user groups, for example, early career scientists or specific countries that do better or worse in that regard. We clearly see big advantages in doing so and have always seen those. The metadata are much richer. We put them in all our XMLs. It's much easier for authors and institutions to link their work. Everything that has been said by Josh and Katrina, we thought it was extremely easy to implement and also easy to maintain. Unfortunately, we don't really today use all the capabilities ORCID offers, so we could do very much better here. What I personally really like is that we go already way beyond papers, so also preprints, peer review reports, editorial comments, maybe all of this appears in an author's ORCID record. And I do receive quite a few emails from authors and reviewers, especially who say, wow, I didn't even know that this was possible. Sort of their peer review reports pop up in the ORCID records, and they say, great, that this is automatic. I guess actually that's it from me. I'm more than happy to sort of talk actively about this. So if there are any questions about Copernicus and ORCID in general, or if you need some lessons learned, do just drop them in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johannes. That was awesome. I loved your phrase, extremely easy to implement and go beyond published article, also covering preprints. I think this is clearly showing the potential and the ambition, which I expect you will also get from Lubo from Pensoft, who will talk about research funders and grants. Lubo?
Yeah, hello. I need to share my slides. Just a second. No, not this. Excuse me, that's my...
It's there. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, we see your inbox, I think.
Yeah. Just a second, please.
Sure.
We'll try again because it doesn't allow me here. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah,
So,
please.
yes,
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah, can you? Yes, slideshow. Thank
Yes,
you.
Okay. Excuse me, please. But okay, I will talk about how we track the acknowledgements to funders and grants in our publication. We have implemented this workflow since, I don't know, but many years in the submission process. But recently we found another application for it thanks to the OA switchboard, because the metadata we collected in the article XMLs about funders and grants, now we send to as a P1 message to OA switchboard. So all journals in our ARPA publishing platform have this feature. During the submission process, the author can select the grant or funder from, let's say, backend database. How it happens? If the author submits a manuscript, then there is a step in the submission process when the author can select from a drop-down menu funders or grant abbreviations or grant names. And we take this from the OpenAIR database and also from FundRef registry of Crossref. The next step is when the article is published, we just in the same way we send acknowledgement message to the authors to inform them that the authors are that the article is published. In the same way, we send also automated P1 message from the article metadata to OA switchboard, and they take care further to send this information to funders and registries. So it's really easy to implement and very valuable feature because it increases the transparency in scholarly publishing, and that transparency is not just to put the content in open access or the data in open access. It speeds up publication because it's fast and easier to find out if the author is eligible for, let's say, APC or so for funding, and it's inclusive, fair, and sustainable. Again, it was not complicated at all to implement this, and I really advise journals to use OpenAIR and FundRef registries databases in the way we do. And my final slide is that it is a kind of nice coincidence, but less than 2 months ago, we published quite a large paper of something like 70 pages, which deals with persistent identifiers, mostly in biodiversity domain, but it contains a lot of general recommendations about how to assign identifiers to article section, subsections, figures, tables, images, supplementary materials, and even to some terms in the article text like names of biological species or DNA sequences and so on. In short, we are much interested in identifiers, and we try to implement them in our routine work as publishers, more and more identifiers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lubo. It's great to see that also here, like Copernicus, you've been doing this for years, and that there is various applications, various use cases that this contributes to. And next over to Rob O'Donnell and Miguel Peralta from Rockefeller University Press, who have a wealth of use cases to make the case. The floor is yours.
Okay, you can see my screen.
Yes.
So thanks so much for having us. And we're here to talk about our use of ROAR. And I'd like to first give Miguel full credit for the Katy Perry references throughout these slides. I've talked about ROAR quite a bit, but never in context of Katy Perry. So in the box on the left, you'll see some information about RUP. The main point here is that we're small. We don't have any technical staff, so we rely heavily on our vendors for development. But we were still able to implement a pretty solid ROAR workflow without spending a great deal of money and with really little trouble. We started using RORs in 2020 when we signed our first read and publish deal. That was with Jisc. We did this because we knew that text-based affiliations are far too variable to drive an accurate workflow. And back in 2020, ROR wasn't being used in any of our systems. So we needed to convince some of our vendors that ROR was the right choice. And we had to pay some development fees. But now for any publishers that use eJournal Press or Silverchair, you're good to go. So talk to them. And on the right is a graphic that just shows how much our workflows now revolve around ROR. And we're going to start at the top and go clockwise. And Miguel, over to you.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that my contribution to the scholarly community is introducing people to Katy Perry, but you've got to, take what you're given. So I have to say it's quite nice to be on the tail end of this presentation because I really have found it very inspirational and very galvanizing, very energizing, which I really think should be the takeaway because, this data work is, in addition to being quantitative, it's also a creative activity. I'm going to be talking less about systems and processes and workflows, but more about a couple of mapping projects that we've done here at RUP to help our transition from hybrid journals to becoming fully open access. We recognized that we needed to better understand the relationship between, on one side, our authorship and our institutional subscriber base on the other. On this slide, I've jumped right into some of the nuts and bolts of what we've been doing here to achieve exactly this by using ROR IDs as the basis of our analyses. So I put 3 of our core ROR projects on this slide, going from the least to the most complex. And I do want to emphasize too that a lot of this work can be done simply in Excel using very basic Excel formulas. And I hope that one of the takeaways from this is that you can go and you can get started on these subsets. One thing to say as well too is, I really designed this part of the presentation around publishers and sort of energizing publishers to do this mapping. But of course, libraries are doing the same exact thing, but with the view flipped. So I hope that's also a sort of a helpful realization. So to start off, we began by applying ROR IDs to our historical authorship data from 2017 to today, which has been about over 3,000 rows of data, which is to say 3,000 corresponding authors on these articles. At the same time, we mapped ROR IDs to our subscriber data, which was an additional 1,200 rows. So for us, a very small scale. If you're a bigger publisher or a library, you might want to start with a subset. In both of these projects, we were able to map ROR IDs by a combination of name matching, Excel tricks, using the email domain. So very basic stuff before moving on to the more complicated projects. And in some cases, like us, you may already have PIDs applied. So for our subscriber base, we already had Ringgold through a certain date. So we were able to jump from Ringgold to ISNI, finally to ROR. Going through this process in this sort of simple, basic subset way can also be an easy in to prepare yourself to move on to more complex projects. And in our case, the most complex project we've done is to map ROR IDs on each author for each paper from 2017 to 2020. About 2,000 papers turned in to over 20,000 rows of data when you take all of the authors, including contributing, and all of their affiliations into consideration. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to demonstrate what happens when you open up the trunk. So in that analysis of those 4 years, this article popped out as the article that had the most affiliations on it, over 100 affiliations on one paper. And just looking at the corresponding author here, we can see 5 affiliations. So this layer of complexity in author affiliations may not be apparent in our submission system, particularly in the past. But having these affiliations ready to go allows us to efficiently quote and send authorship reports to libraries and to support our authorship by marketing these agreements to the authors at these institutions, as well as, of course, to assess our business models that will ultimately get us to a point of being a fully open access publisher. Final slide, please. So, to start off with the question, in fact, or to end with the question, rather, these projects really have 3 broad goals, which is to understand, to action, and then to transform. And so I put a few graphs up that I've created from these projects that have provided insights that have allowed us to progress in our open access journey. So on the left, we have a breakdown of our corresponding authorship by institution. In just this 3-year time period, we saw that 75% of the institutions with authors in our journals published 1 or fewer articles per year. And so this fact alone has allowed us to offer cost-neutral read and publish agreements to these institutions by understanding that the nature of our authorship poses little risk in doing so. On the right, we can see that 2 graphs show how our institutional authorship base changes when you compare, on the one hand, only corresponding authors, and then on the other, all authors. If only viewing the former, our subscriber base eclipses our authorship, our authoring institutions. When you consider all authors, there's parity. There's nearly as many authoring institutions as there are subscribing institutions. To finish off, there's a quote that I really love, and actually it's very resonant with what Josh started off with, which is data is a love note to the future. Pretty much all of the identifiers we've talked about across all speakers in this webinar have applications that we won't really realize until the future happens. And like Josh said, just imagine how much easier and more simple things would be had we implemented these things years ago. And that's really just a call to arms to say data is a central part of what we do, and it's a central part of our future. And the more that data can precipitate future needs, the better off you'll be. So now I'm going to hand it back to Rob, who will talk about how our systems have been developed to better capture this affiliation data.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. That was great. And I just want to mention that, we did implement ORCID and funder IDs almost a decade ago, and RORs in 2020. So we're building it, but yeah, there's a ton of data out there that still does not have the PIDs in them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we manage deals using ROR. So with an EJP, each deal is configured using the eligible RORs for that deal. And the process is then completely driven by those RORs. The system looks for a match between the manuscript affiliation RORs and the deal RORs. And when a match is made, the corresponding author is alerted that they're eligible for the deal, and that information then travels through our production system into the billing system. And on the bottom of this slide is a screenshot showing how we gather ROR IDs for corresponding authors. Right now, we're only requiring them for corresponding authors. We do have plans to require them for all authors, but right now, the submitting author selects the institution from a ROR type ahead menu. And I want to mention here that it's a fairly common complaint I hear that ROR is not granular enough to use in workflows, but we've not come across that problem. So it's important to keep in mind that ROR was purposely designed as a top-level system ID, a top-level ID, and departments and even medical schools don't always have their own IDs. For us, this has really only been a problem from the author perspective. So when the author is choosing ROR, they might not see their medical school, as you can see here. But we've now set up alerts to let these authors know and to not let them choose an organization that does not have a ROR ID. I also note that in the published article, we allow granular affiliations, but they're tagged with the broader ID. And roles play a big role in our workflows outside of deals as well. We're active in the OA switchboard for both reporting and eligibility workflows. That's the P1 and E1 workflows. So when we have manuscript that's not eligible for a deal, we trigger an E1 query asking affiliations and funders on that paper if they're willing to pay the gold APC. We've got RORs in our JAX XML, and they're deposited to Crossref. And with RORs in Crossref, you can do cool things like the example in the black box here, which is a query to find all DOIs that have a Francis Crick ROR and were funded by Wellcome. Right? That's a very simple example, but the more content tagged with RORs, as we've heard earlier, the easier it becomes to service connections between organizations, people, funding, output. And because we have RORs in our subscriber and access control systems on Silverchair, we'll soon be able to easily report on both read and publish metrics to deal partners and potential deal partners. So a lot of the work that Miguel just showed that we manually did will just be easily surfaced with a click of a button in the future. This is a slide that I borrowed from Silverchair, from Emily Farrell at Silverchair. It shows what their system can do and what they have on their roadmap, and I'll just let you look at that later. And please feel free to contact us with any questions about implementing ROR. We're happy to talk about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rob and Miguel. And I think your last remark is critical, Rob, the invitation for others to reach out. And I know you are all super, super willing to share your experiences, and that will help. Claire, I think it's over to you.
Well, I was going to go through the questions, then hand over to Claire, but we are running out of time. But hopefully we'll get through as many of these questions as possible. Thank you very much. Those very informative, useful, great presentations. Okay, so people have I'm going to go through the order they've been upvoted. So I'm going to start with Joe's question, and these are for all panelists, so please feel free to chip in with any answers. About proven best practices when it comes to interlinking DOIs, a preprint, version of record, and also data sets and other related items. Does anyone know of any best practices?
Well, I can take that, but I don't know. It's maybe obvious. We do all of that through Crossref. So all of this goes through Crossref related to tag, and then sort of we collect it up front, collect as many DOIs as we can, put them in our Crossref XML, and then Crossref does the linking for us. I don't know how others handle that, but that's been our best practice for a while now.
Just to say, I think that's a really important point. And for repositories, if you're registering PIDs, then making sure that the metadata schema for whatever PID you choose for that content actually supports linkages between different kinds of entities. So being able to say this is a version of this is the same as that is really critical. And things like the data site schema support that natively. But it's something to think about, because that does seem to be the best pathway to do it, is in the metadata when registering a PID for an entity, is to include the PIDs and the relationship in that metadata, because that enables a two-way connection between the two things. So I think it really supports Johanna's approach there.
Thanks both. Elizabeth's asked about updating metadata in the future, for example, linking future projects, data, etc. Who has the responsibility to do the updates? What feedbacks were imagined? For example, individuals may have this information but do not have access to edit the metadata for DOIs held by publishers, funders, etc.
I think that's a really challenging question, because the answer is different for different kinds of entities. So, for instance, for an ORCID record, the individual that represents or who owns that record can update their information, but they can also give permission to other organisations to add information to it. Whereas for something like a grant DOI or a publication DOI, the responsibility for updating and maintaining that metadata rests with the organisation that registered the DOI in the first place. So we really do need a comprehensive mechanism for being able to relay updates and request those updates. But we also need to be respectful of the fact that actually a lot of these organisations are very busy and they don't necessarily always have time to respond to lots of requests for updates to metadata. I think the key thing is focusing on quality. I also think there are possibilities to highlight links between different systems. So when something is added to an ORCID record, you can tell someone about that. When an ORCID ID is detected in another system, when another ID is detected in another system, that can be added to the ORCID record. You could imagine lots of really helpful interactions between the RAID ID, the research activity identifier for projects, and grant IDs, for instance, in adding investigators who are hired with grant funding. So there's lots of ways these updates could flow, and I think it's not one that has one simple answer to my knowledge. I'll be interested to see if others know of any other more consistent approaches that could be taken.
Can I add to that, Josh? You said it depends on the organization. I would add it also very, very much depends on the use case. Right. So what are you really doing and what is the purpose, and where does the value of that metadata originate from? And that could differ case by case. So I think people need to be mindful of that. And and this is my personal opinion, the illusion or the idea that you could have everything in one place updated is and up to date and correct is an illusion, because it depends on the use case. And a lot of things are also time specific. So yeah, bear that in mind.
Thanks. Can move quickly on. From Joe saying that just want to mention that RAW is of utmost importance for institutions to claim ownership of their research output, especially in Africa and anywhere, and thus significantly improve any university or other scholarly ranking attempts. If those even make sense. Any thoughts on this by speakers? Well, we're all pro-RAW, so I think no one's got any comments on that.
Well, maybe only an invitation. We've done a big project with ROAR last year, and the invitation to all institutions around the world to make sure that their entry in the ROAR registry is correct and complete. So that is a really important starting point also for all these text-based matching and what have you in order to achieve the end result. So invitation for institutions around the world to check if their entry is correct and complete in the ROAR registry. And otherwise, there's one email address that you can use to give feedback to the ROAR organization to get it updated.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just to briefly add to that too, the ROAR community is like super helpful and responsive to these requests. So of course, any community is not perfect, but at least in our experience at RUP, we've found that ROAR is really amenable to fixing their hierarchies and fixing their organizations. This is also something that publishers have a role in. So, our workflow depends on ROAR IDs to identify eligible articles. And so, for instance, we recently had a consortium join to read and publish that was 70 plus institutions. And we've been through this process with ROAR with both the institutions and with ROAR of identifying what is accurate in their hierarchies and what needs to be changed.
I'll just add to that. I mean, ROAR is a community-based curation process. And if we find any that are missing, our production editors put in that request to ROAR. So it takes the community to build those ROARs for each organization.
Yeah, my understanding is that anyone can actually put in a ROAR for any institution if you find it missing. So actually, we can help increase the adoption. For example, ROARs for Chinese institutions could be helped that way as well, because where there's less adoption.
Okay, I'm going on the upvote, so there's only one more question to be upvoted. I don't have time to go through the other 5, unfortunately. But Ursula's asked about publishers implementing PIDs across OA journals and OA books in the publish OA books. Are the publishers, implementing PIDs across OA journals and books in an equal way, or are the workflows for OA books different?
We don't have a book program, so it doesn't apply to us.
No one else wants to respond to that one? Okay. As we've got 2 minutes left, and I need to hand over to Claire. Thank you for those questions. I mean, we can try and review those and obviously answer them after the event. But I'm going to hand over now to Claire.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so just to finish off the webinar, and hello to everybody. I'm here representing OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association. I'm really pleased that we've been able to co-host this webinar with Jisc, focusing specifically on PIDs for publishers and bringing you all of these publisher experiences. So if you're a publisher and you're just starting to think about this, then what do you do next? Finding the right person at your organization and getting their buy-in is really important. And if you're small, that may be the senior person in the organization. If you're bigger, is there somebody who is involved in the end-to-end journey at your organization? So you need to have somebody who's going to help you make decisions, but really gets all of this stuff and the importance of it. As you can see, there's a lot happening in this space. If you're outsourcing everything, that can be a bit more difficult, but we've got examples of that too. So you can speak to whoever is your service provider that you work with. We understand it might not be easy. So we'd like to hear from you. What kind of examples and support would you need? Hopefully there's lots here in this webinar, but there are plenty of organizations working in this space. So there's a community here to help you get started. We appreciate there's no such thing as a publisher. Every single publisher is different, and that's important too. But we really want to be able to particularly see small publishers be able to participate and implement PIDs in their workflows as well. So yeah, get in touch, and if you have problems, tell us why. We might have navigated the problems that you're having already, and we probably have an example from within our community. So with that, just on the hour, I will finish here. I just want to say thank you again to Jisc for hosting. Thank you to all of our speakers today and these fantastic examples, to More Brains for all the work they are doing to move this forward under Jisc's leadership. And thank you to you attendees for joining us. Great to see you all.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, thank you to all the presenters, panelists.